Dawn crept over the Wyoming mountains like a secret whispered to the earth, soft, pale, and trembling with cold light. Frost clung to the pines in a way that made them look dusted with old silver, as if time itself had grown tired and wanted to rest a moment longer on their branches. Out there, where the wind carried only the cries of distant hawks and the memories of men who had long walked away, the truth of people's hearts felt louder than any gunfire ever could. Some stories, the old say, begin with thunder or gold or the crack of a duel at high noon. But this one began with a kindness so quiet the world might have missed it, had it not changed the lives of two people who believed the world had already carved them into loneliness. Mercy Dalton's boots crunched across the thin frost as she made her way up the slope to the Boone Ranch. She walked as she always did, steady, humble, carrying more weight inside her heart than on her back. The widow had grown used to the mountain silence. It didn't judge her, didn't whisper behind her, didn't look at her with pity disguised as kindness. She preferred the whisper of wind to the sidelong stares of the townsfolk who said her name with a tone that suggested they already knew the shape of her sorrow. Inside the Boone cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, old furniture, and the faint medicinal herbs she'd tucked into a pouch for Martha Boone. The kitchen was dim, lit only by a weak morning sun filtering through warped glass. Elias Boone, once a rancher with shoulders broader than winter itself, sat hunched at the table, hands trembling as he tried to hold a spoon. "Easy now, Mr. Boone," Mercy murmured, her voice carrying that soft strength born from necessity. "No hurry. The day'll still be here when you finish this." Elias muttered something about being a burden, a useless old mule left in the field too long. Mercy only smiled, even though her eyes, gray as a rain-faded photograph, held a quiet ache. She knew too well the weight of watching someone fade. She knew the sharp edge of feeling unnecessary in a world that had moved on without you. But she didn't speak of any of that. She simply steadied his hand, patient as snowfall. Martha Boone watched from the rocker, wrapped in a quilt so worn the colors had turned to memories. She saw more than she said. She noticed Mercy's gentleness, the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear, the exhaustion carved under her eyes. The widow reminded her of a candle burned too long in an empty room, still glowing, but tired of burning for no one. "You're a good girl, Mercy," Martha said in her tender, creased voice. Mercy shook her head. "Just doing what needs doing, ma'am." But Martha knew the truth. Goodness like Mercy's didn't come from obligation. It came from a heart that had been broken and chose to remain soft anyway. Far above, on the ridge where the world felt untouched by human breath, Calder Boone began his descent. He moved with the quiet familiarity of a man who'd spent more years speaking to trees and sky than to people. His shoulders carried the mountain solitude. His silence carried everything else: shame, regret, the weight of leaving behind a town that never quite trusted him. He'd been away for months, living the high pines where judgment couldn't find him. But when he saw fresh tracks leading toward his parents' cabin, small, neat, unmistakably a woman's, something tightened in his chest. Intruder? Charity? Pity? He didn't know which bothered him more. Calder approached the cabin slow, careful, as if the mountain itself paused to listen. Through the window, he saw a figure bent over his father, a murmured comfort on her lips. A woman he didn't recognize at first, only the shape of her care, the softness of her hands guiding the trembling spoon. He stepped inside, the door creaking like it, too, knew the weight of his return. Mercy froze. She straightened so quickly her apron rustled, eyes wide, cheeks flushing with that nervous heat of someone caught in the middle of goodness and guilt. Calder stood there, tall and worn by wilderness, beard thick, eyes dark with questions he didn't know how to ask. Their gazes collided like two weary souls recognizing the loneliness in the other. Mercy began, then swallowed, unsure of her place, unsure if she'd trespassed on a boundary she didn't know existed. They needed a little help. Calder looked to his father, who avoided his eyes, ashamed of his weakness. Then to his mother, who met his stare with that unspoken command only a mother gives. "Be grateful, boy." He turned back to the widow. "Thank you," he said, voice rough from months of silence. A single word, but it held sincerity sturdy enough to stand on its own. Mercy nodded, unable to speak. Her heart beat fast, not with infatuation, but with the shock of being seen. Not as pity, not as gossip's plaything, but as someone offering something real. Calder didn't linger. He didn't know how to. Instead, he busied himself with the stove, the water bucket, anything to make his hands useful. But his eyes drifted to her, quietly, curiously, each time she soothed his father's frustration or lifted Martha's blanket with gentle precision. The town, however, wasted no time turning that quiet mourning into whispers. By noon, Ivy Miller sat in the saloon, spreading stories with the sharp flick of her tongue. Mercy Dalton was sniffing around the Boone ranch. Calder Boone, the mountain ghost, couldn't care for his own folks. The widow was desperate, lonely, looking for a man. Some said she hoped to tie herself to the Boone name. Others said Calder had invited her, secretly, scandalously. None of it was true, but truth rarely stood a chance against the hunger of bored tongues. Mercy heard the whispers 2 days later when she came into town for flour. The glances, the smirks, they pierced sharper than any arrow. Still, she returned to the Boones. She would not let gossip dictate her decency. Calder noticed her quiet arrival each time, and something in him, something long buried, began to soften. He found himself repairing her fence in secret, replacing her broken porch step, leaving small bundles of chopped wood on her stoop before dawn. He didn't sign his name. He didn't have to. Mercy noticed. She simply never mentioned it. Their connection grew in those small, wordless gestures, the shared lifting of firewood, the moment their hands brushed when she passed him a bowl, the way she lingered near the door when she left, as if hoping he'd ask her to stay a moment longer. Neither did. Not yet. But tenderness has a way of blooming between two people who've lived too long in the shadows of others' judgment. Calder's mother watched with a soft smile. She'd lived long enough to know that hearts, stitched with loneliness, often recognized each other before minds did. But the town didn't smile. And when Calder heard Ivy Miller mocking Mercy outside the general store, laughing about the widow who couldn't keep her hands to herself, shame hit him like a blow to the chest. Not shame for her, shame for himself, for letting them hurt the one person whose kindness had returned warmth to his parents' home, for allowing gossip to spread in his silence, for hiding in the mountains while Mercy stood alone in the valley of small, cruel words. He considered retreating back into the pines, the only place where judgment couldn't reach him. A man can grow used to loneliness when it's the only thing that doesn't ask anything from him. But when he saw Mercy standing at the Boone gate that evening, lantern in hand, shoulders squared in quiet defiance, eyes carrying that familiar look of someone bracing for abandonment, something inside him broke open like ice under spring sunlight. He realized the cost of leaving wasn't his loneliness. It was hers. And for the first time in years, Calder Boone stepped closer to the world instead of away from it. Winter winds swept through Mercy Dalton's small shop the next morning, carrying with them the stale, poisonous scent of gossip. Fewer customers came. Those who did avoided her eyes, offering forced politeness dipped in judgment. It was Ivy Miller, of course, who struck the hardest blow, loud enough for everyone to hear as Mercy passed the saloon. "Poor thing," Ivy drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "A widow clinging to any boon she can find. Shame don't suit her, does it?" Laughter followed, thick and sharp. Mercy kept walking. Her steps were steady, but something inside her wavered, trembling like a lantern flame in a storm. She didn't cry, not where they could see, but her heart folded in on itself, worn by a lifetime of being misunderstood. And for the first time since she began helping the Boone parents, she wondered if she'd done wrong by offering kindness. She stayed home the next day, and the one after that. On the third morning, she still couldn't bring herself to walk up the mountain trail. She sat by her window instead, hands clenched around a cold cup of coffee, staring at the frost creeping along the glass like growing loneliness. Up at the ranch, Calder noticed her absence immediately. His mother's breaths grew more strained. Elias Boone seemed lost, calling Mercy's name once by mistake. The house, once warmed by the rhythm of Mercy's gentle steps, felt cold again, colder than the weather outside. Calder sat alone by the dying hearth that night, shadows dancing across his face. He had lived through blizzards, through wolves circling campfires, through storms so fierce they split trees in half. He had survived hunger that gnawed at bone, solitude that chewed at the edges of sanity. Yet none of those had ever frightened him the way Mercy's quiet absence did. He'd let her be torn apart by the same town that once chased him into the mountains. He had allowed history to repeat itself. A man could hide from judgment, but he could not hide from the truth that he'd failed someone who deserved better. So at dawn the next day, Calder Boone saddled his horse and headed for town, each hoofbeat echoing a resolve he'd been too ashamed to hold before. When he arrived, the street fell silent. Dust swirled around him like a restless ghost as he dismounted. Every eye followed him. The mountain man had returned, not for supplies, not for trouble, but carrying something heavier, purpose. He saw Ivy Miller at the general store, her voice high and sweet as she entertained a small crowd. Calder didn't rush. He walked toward them with the slow, steady gait of someone unafraid to face a room filled with whispers. When he reached them, he stopped just behind Ivy. His shadow fell across the dusty boards. "Keep talking," he said, voice low, calm. "Go on." Ivy stiffened. Her smile faltered as she turned. "See, Calder, I didn't." "Say it again." His eyes were dark and unblinking. "And say it with her standing here." The group scattered like spooked birds. Ivy, suddenly trembling, found no words. Sheriff Judd Harlan stepped out of his office, thumbs hooked in his belt. He didn't approach to restrain Calder. He approached to address the gossipers who lingered nearby, pretending innocence. "This town's turned sour," he said, "and I reckon the ones poisoning it know who they are." His gaze swept over Ivy. "If Mercy Dalton's the best target you folks can find, then you'd best pray heaven's kinder than you've been." Nobody argued with him. Shame hung thick as smoke. Mercy had watched all of it from behind the window of her shop. Her breath caught as Calder turned, scanning the street until he found her shadow in the glass. She stepped outside before she could convince herself otherwise. Calder walked toward her slowly, like a man afraid to spook a wounded animal. She stood behind the shop, out of sight from the main road, where the world felt quieter, more honest. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I should have done it sooner," he replied. The wind tugged at Mercy's hair, carrying the winter scent of pine and frost. She blinked hard, tried to hold back tears she hated showing. Calder didn't step closer, didn't touch her, only stood near enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence. "I thought you believed what they said," she admitted, her voice barely more than breath. Calder's jaw tightened. "I don't listen to people who've never lived a day of real hardship. I sure as hell don't listen to anyone about you." Mercy's breath shivered in her chest. For months, she'd carried her grief alone, tending to others as a way to keep from falling apart. And here stood a man carved by silence, telling her she mattered without dressing it in fancy words. Their hands brushed as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was accidental, but neither pulled away. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath around them. But fate had a way of reminding people that tenderness rarely comes without a test. That evening, Elias Boone collapsed by the fireplace, his breath shallow. Martha panicked, calling out for her son. Calder lifted his father into bed, but saw the fear in Martha's eyes. Fear that old age and illness had twisted too far, too fast. He thought only one thing: Mercy. He saddled his horse and rode through the darkening dusk, hooves pounding against the cold earth. When he reached her cabin, she opened the door before he even knocked, breathless as if she'd sensed disaster on the wind. "It's your father, isn't it?" she asked. He only nodded. Mercy didn't hesitate. She gathered her coat, her herbs, her resolve, and followed him back into the night. No fear of gossip, no fear of judgment, only compassion that ran deeper than pride. Back at the ranch, her presence was a balm. She checked Elias's breathing, pressed warm cloths to his forehead, soothed his trembling hands. Calder stood beside her, watching with something like awe at the quiet strength in her movements. At one point, their hands met over the blanket, his calloused, hers gentle. Calder didn't pull away. Mercy didn't either. For a moment, it felt like the universe had stitched a thread between them. By morning, Elias stabilized. Word spread quickly, too quickly. By midday, a cluster of townsfolk had gathered outside the Boone Ranch, masking curiosity with false concern. Ivy Miller was among them. Like a vulture circling a story she hoped would end badly. Mercy stepped out onto the porch, exhausted but steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You don't get to decide who I am," she said softly. "You don't get to punish me for kindness or shame folks who need help. I'm done letting your words carve me into someone smaller." Her voice shook, but her spine held firm. Calder watched her from the doorway, pride warming him from the inside, soft as sunrise. The townsfolk shifted uneasily before turning away, some ashamed, some silently changed. Later, Calder offered to walk Mercy home. She agreed. The path was quiet, lined with frost-tipped sagebrush and the deepening gold of dusk. Mercy's steps were slower now, not from weakness, but from a peace she hadn't felt in a long while. Calder walked beside her, hands in his pockets, wrestling with words he'd never spoken before. When they reached her gate, he stopped. "You gave my parents more than I ever could have asked," he said, voice low. "You gave them dignity, and you gave me a reason to stop running from this town." Mercy swallowed hard as warmth prickled her eyes. "I wasn't trying to save anyone," she whispered. "Just didn't want them to feel alone." Calder's eyes softened. "You didn't." He reached out then, slow, deliberate, and took her hand. Not a promise, not a declaration, just presence, just a beginning. And maybe that was enough. For in the end, as the narrator murmurs to the reader like an old friend sharing a final truth, maybe all a weary soul needs is one person brave enough to see past the dust and rumors. In a world loud with judgments, quiet kindness still changes the course of lives, even our own.